We're going to be going over the general layout of Autodesk Maya and its controls, and pretty much the basics that you'll need to know of navigating through Autodesk Maya. So, right from the get-go, Autodesk Maya is an industry standard tool. It is used by companies like Pixar, Nintendo, pretty much any company that works with 3D, animation, game design, virtual reality, augmented reality, all those different types of companies. They used either Autodesk Maya or a program pretty similar to it. So today we're just going to go over the basics of just kind of understanding what Maya is and how we work with it. Just a general tool setup. So Maya is a 3D modeling program first and an animation program second. It does rendering, texturing, pretty much everything you need to do to create 3D animations or 3D assets for games. So just going through, we'll go through the top bar first and we'll move around just to kind of give you an idea on what's going on here. So the first bar, we're just going to go through File. So we have New Scene, which will create a new project. Open Scene if we have one already. Save Scene and Save Scene As for saving our projects. Importing and exporting objects into our scene or exporting them out of our scene. Setting projects, which is going to be very important later on. And then recent files and projects. Edit pretty much has our standard editing commands. So copy, paste, deleting, things like that. Create is going to be a tab that we use quite often. It's where we get to our object primitives like NURBs and polygons. It also has where we have lights and cameras, which we use a lot when we're rendering or doing animation. Select, we don't really need to use too much in the beginning. Modify, we use a little bit, not too much in the beginning, but we use things like freeze transformation, centering pivots, and converting every once in a while. Display just kind of shows what's being displayed in our screen. So we have our heads-up display, displaying different objects or different parts of it. Windows, we usually use this to get into the different settings or editors. We use this a lot more later on, but from the beginning we don't really touch it too much. Mesh we use later on when we start working with polygonal modeling. They have our booleans, quadrangulating, triangulating, and things like that, but we'll get a lot more into that when we work with polygons. Edit mesh, same deal. Mesh tools, pretty much the same thing. We use it a little bit when we're working with polygons, and then we use it a lot more once we really dive into polygonal modeling. Mesh display, we don't really use too much. Curves, we don't use too much till later on. Surfaces we use a little bit in the beginning. And same with deform, but we usually use deform around like animation. UV we use later on for pretty much texturing our characters or objects or anything we're making. And the rest we don't really need to know too much about. Arnold is a renderer, we'll talk about that later. So the next thing we have is our tabs over here, the next set, which basically lets us switch into customize settings for doing different things. So we have our modeling tab, rigging, animation, FX, rendering, and your own personal ones if you customize your own. For the beginning, we usually use just modeling, and we'll use rigging and animation later on, and rendering. Other than that, all these tools right here are pretty much just quick click tools for saving, opening files, things like that. We don't really need to use any of this. This area is for rendering and texturing, but we'll get into that later. The next set is another subset of things like creating things. So we'll use the poly modeling tab for creating polygons, curve/surfaces for creating NURB objects, things like that. We don't really use them too much, but they can be very helpful when you get into them later on. So next thing we have is our viewport. So our viewport is a perspective view. You could tell it's perspective from the bottom right here where it says perspective, and the fact that we could actually maneuver it. So maneuvering in Maya is maneuvering in a 3D space, which is extremely important, extremely useful, because you need to be able to maneuver that way in order to create your 3D objects. So super helpful. If I tap on the spacebar, I will split into 4 different views. So we have our perspective view, which we were just in, our side view, which is on the negative x-axis, our front view, which is the negative z-axis, and the top view, which is our negative y-axis. If we ever wanted to go into one of those views to get a better look, we could just tap space again and it will zoom in on it. Your mouse cursor must be in that area. So just to kind of go through this, 3D modeling, since it works into a 3D space, uses the 3 different axes. We have the X, Y, and Z. So if you ever took a class in geometry, this is pretty simple. I'm actually going to look at it through, let's just say, my front view. And if you look right here, we have a grid. So in this area right here, if you ever took a geometry class, you'll know that this is the x-axis. So this line going across horizontally. And we know to the right is positive, to the left is negative. We also know that this line right here is the y-axis, up for positive, down for negative. But the big difference is we're going to be working in a 3D space. So we also have the z-axis. So if I look at right here, my perspective view again, and see that this line right here is our x-axis, this one right here is actually our z-axis. So towards us would be positive, so right here would be positive, this way would be negative. So that's the way we're kind of working within a 3D space. If you ever get confused on where you're looking, you could always refer back here to the bottom left corner where it shows the 3 axes. So it'll show X, which is red, Y is green, and blue for Z. And it's pretty useful. This way you don't know if if your object is upside down or facing the wrong way or moving the wrong way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to create, and I'm going to create another primitive sphere. So once I create an object, the object always spawns on the 0, 0, 0 axis, which is smack dab in the center of our grid. So before we move forward, it would be very useful to understand how to maneuver through this. So maneuvering in a 3D space is pretty simple. It uses a couple of keyboard commands along with a mouse, and working with them is very easy. So if I hold the Alt button or the Option button if you're on a Mac, and you left mouse click and drag, you're able to rotate around your scene, just like that. If I hold Alt or Option and middle mouse click, so click down on your scroll wheel, you'll be able to pan around your scene, just like so. And Alt and right mouse click will allow you to zoom in and out. You could also use your scroll wheel by holding Alt or Option and using the right mouse click or mouse button will allow you to zoom in and out a little smoother, which could be very useful when getting those little details. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the object itself. So it spawns on the 0, 0 axis, and we have different tools of modifying it. So we have this icon right here, which is the select tool. So that will allow me to select objects. When an object is selected, you'll see that it lights up like that. We have the move tool, which will allow us to maneuver the location of the object. So whatever I have selected, it will move. So I have a red, green, and blue arrow, which symbolize the X, Y, and Z. I can click on those and drag them, and it will move wherever I want it to go. So I'll just undo that. You also have this center square right here, and these squares over here. I don't recommend touching them because it maneuvers it in a 3D space, which can get very confusing early on. So I don't usually like using them. Next up, we have the rotate tool, which works the same way. You could click on one of these lines and rotate along the axes. So I'm rotating along the y-axis, or the x, or the z. You also have this light blue one, which also works with all 3 at the same time. I also don't recommend using that. The last one we're going to work with is the scale tool. So the scale tool is very useful. It works the same way as the other tools, except you can see a lot more of a change with it. So we could scale along the x-axis, the y-axis, and z-axis. We also have this one in the center. The one in the center will allow us to scale symmetrically along all three axes. So if I want to scale it all the way up or all the way down, we can. And it's all extremely useful. So one thing you're going to want to learn early on is a couple of hotkeys. So for these tools, the ones you're going to use most, it's very simple to remember. If we looked at our keyboard, Q would be for the select tool, W would be for move, E would be for rotate, and R for scale. And the easiest way to figure out which one it is, or to learn them early on, is if you look at your keyboard, they are the first four letters of QWERTY, and they are the icons going from top to bottom. Always a very useful tip to really get you started. So the next thing we're going to talk about is this area right here. This is the channel box / layer editor. What this is basically showing you all of the math involved, or all the data involved with your object. So for example, if I switch to my move tool, and let's just say I move this sphere on the x-axis, you will see the translate x on the right side start going up because I'm going on along the positive axis on the x. Same things if I go negative, it'll move on the negative x-axis. The easiest way to see this is if we were thinking of it just like geometry again. If I go and move it along the x, or if I move it along the y, you could see exactly where it is in proportion to the 3D space. So it's extremely useful when it comes to animation, and it's also very useful when it comes to getting exact spots for your object. So let's just say I want to make sure this is right on the 3, and I'll just hit enter to add it, and it will go 3 spaces on the grid. Same thing if I went like 2 here, and let's just say 5 here. We could always go and zero those out. And we now have everything there. Same thing goes for rotate and scale. So if I wanted to, let's just say raise this to 3, it will raise it. And if I want to rotate this, the rotations will go by a degree. So if I wanted to go rotate X 45 degrees, I'd type in 45. Because I'm working with a sphere, it will go 360 degrees, but it will also go with pretty much any object that you're rotating around in a 3D space. So the next thing we have is inputs, and inputs are very important for NURBS especially. So inputs will basically show the data of how this object was created. So it has a radius of 1, the start sweep is 0, end sweep is 360. And if I ever change this, you can see how an object is created. So if I raise it up, let's see, well, let me do it this way, yeah. I'll just drag it, and you can see that as the increase in number for 360 degrees, it will create the whole object. Sections and spans for how many pieces this is sliced into, which we'll talk more about when we go into NURB modeling, and the height ratio, which we don't really touch. Other than that, we have the layers editor right here. So what a layer editor is it'll basically let you have a couple objects. So let's just say I'll create a nice cylinder. I'll move you over here, and I have a sphere. So this will let you create layers. So in this case, since my sphere is selected, I'm going to go to this icon right here to add it to a new layer. There it is, and you see a V for visibility. I'm going to click on that, turn it to visibility off, and now I can't select that object, nor can I see it. It still exists in the 3D space, but you just can't see it. It's very useful to kind of get yourself organized and keep things all nice and tidy. So let's get rid of that. The last thing we're going to touch on is this time slider right here. So when we get into animation, we use this quite frequently. It will tell us how many frames we are moving through and pretty much sets everything up for our animations. But we'll get a lot more into that later on. And that's pretty much all you need to know for the general layout of Autodesk Maya 2020. If you use a previous version of it, that's okay too. It doesn't really change too much, and all this stuff is transferable back. So thank you.